Hello YouTube, I'm Vince White. I'm an employment attorney. On this channel, we answer publicly posted questions from YouTube users, getting folks the answers they need from an employment attorney. We have a question here from YouTube user Sarah Wood, context, Sarah posted on a video in which was entitled, "Does an employer need to be aware of your disability in order to be accused of discrimination?" And the answer to that question is yes. You can't, generally speaking, be guilty of discriminating against a protected class if you are not aware that the person you are acting against is in that protected class, right? It would be very difficult to prove discrimination when the response is, well, how could we discriminate? We didn't know this person was in that protected class, right? But YouTube user Sarah Wood commented, what about perceived disability as per the ADA? We have a bunch of videos about perceived disability on the channel. You can go ahead and check those out. So I'm going to give a very, very quick rundown of what perceived disability is. It is when the employer believes, for whatever reason, that you have a disability, even though you may or may not, right? So, give an example. I'll give you two examples. One very, very common form of perceived disability is for young doctors who are going through their learning hospital rotations. It can be very stressful, and there's a lot of wellness programs. And sometimes those wellness programs will say, hey, we think you're really depressed, or you have a really bad anxiety condition, and we think you might be experiencing suicidal ideation. And the young doctor will say, she or he will say, no, I'm fine. I appreciate the concern, but I'm fine, and I'm succeeding in my role. I do not currently have either of those conditions. I'm not suffering from those conditions, and I'm not experiencing suicidal ideation. And yet these wellness programs will wash young student doctors out of programs saying, hey, no, they're not doing well. They're not okay. They're suffering. They have a disability, and they need to treat that before they can go forward. So they're going to have to wash out of our program. So that's perceived disability in a nutshell, right? That the employer comes to you and says, hey, we think you have a disability, and we're going to do something negative to you, wash you out of the program, right? The negative workplace consequence, as a result of our perception that you have a disability. Another good example would be substance abuse problems, right? So a lot of times employers will come to people and say, hey, we think you're an alcoholic or like an opiate addict, whatever it is. And so we got to let you go. Well, the person being accused of that may not be an addict at all, right? Like, and there might be no evidence. It might just be like, oh, Jimmy from accounting says he saw you like huffing paint a couple weeks back. And you're like, I don't huff paint. I painted my house, but it wasn't spray paint. Like, I wasn't huffing paint. Like, what are you talking about? And they're like, Jimmy from accounting says, so you got to go, right? Like, and all of a sudden, you've been accused of a substance abuse disability, an addiction disability, which is protected in most jurisdictions and to some extent under the federal laws. And so even though you don't have that condition, you've been accused of having a disability. Your employer perceives you to have a disability, and they do something negative to you on the basis of that disability, so you have a perceived disability claim. Now, last example, important example, perceived disability where you do have the disability. Let's say you do have an alcohol problem. It's gotten the better of you. You went through treatment. You're back on your feet, but you haven't told your employer about it. You were able to use your time off and your FMLA and not disclose your disability and get treatment, and you're like, you're going, right? You are on the wagon, to use a term that I think alcoholics don't appreciate. So I apologize for that. And you're going to work, succeeding. And the employer says, hey, Jimmy from accounting says you're a booze hound. Jimmy from accounting says you're an alcoholic. and so we got to let you go. Well, you do have that disability. You do suffer and live with alcoholism, and you're taking steps to mitigate the harm in your life. And your employer doesn't know that for a fact. You didn't disclose your disability to your employer. You didn't ask for accommodations. But the employer comes to you and says, hey, we think you're an alcoholic, so we're going to do something negative to you. It's still perceived disability discrimination because you did not. It's actually both in some ways, and hear me out on this. It's perceived disability because they perceive you to have a disability, and there's a negative workplace consequence. It's also knew or should have known, which is the standard for the employer being aware of your disability, right? Like if you don't go to your employer and disclose your disability, you can still argue they had effective notice. They should have known. So in that scenario where they perceive you to have a disability that you actually have but you have not disclosed, you would argue in tandem both that you have the disability and they should have known you have the disability and that they are discriminating against you on the basis of that protected class, but also that they perceive you to have that disability. And that because they perceive you to have that disability, you are then being targeted on the basis of that class. And you would argue those both, and you would say, listen, it's one or the other. I don't live in their hearts and minds. I don't know which it is, but it's one or the other. It's clearly discrimination. Judge, you can decide. Arbitrator, you can decide, but it's one of these two. So, Sarah, yeah, you're absolutely correct. Perceived disability does get play here. And it does a lot of damage to a lot of people's lives. Like, it's very, very strange how often we're seeing perceived disability now. And you'll find this in some very progressive workplaces where you'll have these decrees like, well, everyone has a mental health disability. Everyone should be treating with a mental health professional. Todd Lee's not treating with a mental health professional, so clearly Todd Lee's not being serious about Todd Lee's mental health issues, so Todd Lee's gotta go. Todd Lee's gotta get fired. Yeah, so you don't, as an employer, get to just decree diagnoses upon your employees, right? Like that's like knew or should have known is a real standard, and that there's a lot of validity to that, right? Like if Todd Lee's I don't know, trying to think, if Todd Lee's going around pouring vodka in his coffee all day at work, well, you can legitimately know that Todd Lee probably has an alcohol problem, or at least you perceive Todd Lee to have an alcohol problem, right? But if Todd Lee's, I don't know, let's say Todd Lee's hair is a bit patchy. Todd Lee's, there's just some hair on the sides coming out, right? You as the employer, not Todd Lee's medical professional, not Todd Lee's mental health professional, you say, Todd Lee's hair is getting patchy. That's a sign of an anxiety condition. Todd Lee's not cutting it, and he's got to go. You don't get to diagnose, right? And also, if you perceive someone to have a disability, the answer to that perception, it's already a bold claim. It's quite a leap to just put a disability on someone. But okay, let's say you feel justified. I walked in the break room. Todd Lee was pouring mini bottles of vodka into his coffee, just like Keanu Reeves in Street Kings. Actually, that's probably not a good movie to reference. That movie is probably a little racist. He's pouring mini bottles of vodka into his coffee. Middle of the day, 11 a.m. Not okay. This is a workplace, right? Todd Lee dropped a bag of Vicodin with somebody else's name on the bottle in the office. I mean, that could be a sign of an opiate addiction. Certainly, your perception may be justified. But the move there is, hey, Todd Lee, we're a little concerned about the bottle of Vicodin with somebody else's name on it. Do you want to tell us anything? Because we have an affirmative duty to engage in a reasonable accommodation dialogue. But also, if you don't let us engage in a reasonable accommodation dialogue, we might have to do something to protect our business, right? And there's a tension there. It's a tough place for the employer to be, in all honesty, because they have affirmative duties to the disabled employee. Also, they can't let the employee do harm to the business because they can't afford it, and it could harm their clients. It could harm other workers, right? If you have a forklift operator in a crowded warehouse pouring vodka into his thermos every day, guess what? Someone's going to get crushed fairly soon. So you do have to do something. And they're going to go to their attorney, like a compliance attorney like Eric Sarver, who's coming back on the channel next month. And actually pretty soon, in a couple weeks. And they're going to have to say, like, listen, how do we handle this? And we're not here to help employers do that. But we're help hypothetically somebody navigate this perceived disability thing from the employee side, right? So the employer is going to go talk to an attorney like Eric Sarver. And the employee might go talk to an attorney like us. And we're going to say, well, okay, Todd Lee, do you have a disability? Do you have an addiction? If you do, get in your request for accommodation right away to secure additional protections and get the help you need so you can start combating this disability, right? Now, let's be frank. Most people dealing with an addiction or an alcoholism disability don't proactively go seek the help of an attorney. That is somewhat rare. Probably, if I had to guess, happens in like 1% of cases. So generally what we see is the aftermath. Hey, the employer never knew I had a disability. I crushed a guy with never knew I had an addiction disability. I crushed a guy with a forklift. He's dead now. Can they fire me? Well, you hid the disability. They didn't know. They shouldn't have known, right? Because you hid the disability. We can't argue they should have known. You dodged the alcohol tests or whatever it was. And they didn't perceive you to have a disability. So, yeah, there's no protections here. You're just someone who let their disability get the better of them, didn't seek help, and now someone's crushed to death. Not a lot I can do to help you with that, right? That's and listen, that's dark in a variety of ways. But I mean, let's be clear about this. There are consequences for the coworkers. There are consequences for the business. I do fully believe that someone with an addiction or alcohol disability should have an accommodation, should be able to seek treatment, right? That I do believe that. If you don't take advantage of that, there's not so much the employer can do besides offer that, right? I mean, at some point they're going to have to say, hey, this is dangerous. This is really bad, right? Like if you've got a CFO with a serious gambling addiction, which is a disability in many jurisdictions, and you're like, hey, it seems like you have a serious gambling addiction, and it seems like you're in the hole like $500,000, and we don't love you balancing the books and having like check rating capabilities when you're dealing with that addiction. Especially when you're not engaged in treatment. Like if you were engaged in treatment, we could work out an accommodation. We could figure this out. We care about you, maybe, right? Different employers are different. Some employers will care. An employer is a lot more likely to care about their CFO than they are to care about some other employee, right? The CFO matters to the company from the perception of the owners in a way that underemployees may not. So you have a higher chance of them doing what they got to do. You also have a higher chance of them being aware of the issues with the CFO, right? If your forklift operator has a gambling addiction, most employers will not be aware or will not perceive, wouldn't even take the time to have a perception about the forklift operator, right? Anyways, I think I'm going long here, but Sarah, perceived disability, it can certainly be the basis of a claim under the ADA. It can also be argued in tandem with you should have known about the disability or you perceive the disability. Certainly viable and a viable path forward in many situations. I hope this helps. And I wish you the greatest of luck. If it did help, like, subscribe, comment down below, share the channel so that it may grow. Take care.